The rain in Deadwood didn't wash things clean. It just turned the dust into a slurry of black mud that swallowed boots and hope in equal measure. Inside the Black A saloon, the air was thick enough to chew a suffocating stew of cheap cigar smoke, unwashed bodies, and the copper tang of spilled ale. Silas Vane sat at the center table, sweat beading on his upper lip like dew on a dying flower. He was a small man, possessed of a silver tongue that had long since tarnished, and eyes that darted around the room with the frantic energy of a trapped rat. His hands, stained with ink and tobacco, trembled as he held his cards. 2 pair, 8s and queens. It wasn't enough. He knew it wasn't enough. Across from him sat Frenchie, a card shark with a face like a hatchet and a smile that revealed teeth filed to points. Frenchie didn't sweat. He sat perfectly still, his eyes dead and flat, like a lizard sunning itself on a rock. He tapped his long, manicured fingers on the felt. "The bet is $50, Vane," Frenchie purred, his voice sliding through the smoke like oil. "Put up or fold, and looking at your pile, I'd say you're done." Silas swallowed hard. His pile of chips was gone. His pocket watch was gone. The deed to the small patch of rocky land he claimed to own was already sitting in the center of the table. I need a moment," Silas stammered, wiping his palms on his trousers. "You need a miracle," Frenchie corrected, "or you need to leave." In the corner of the saloon, hidden in the shadows of a stairwell, Clara O'Malley sat on a crate. She was knitting. Her needles click, 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 were the only thing keeping her anchored to the earth. She was 22, with hair the color of midnight, and eyes that held the deep, silent sorrow of the Irish coast she had left behind. She didn't speak. She hadn't spoken since she was 12, since the day the fire took her voice and her innocence. To the men of the town, she was Silas's mute, a simpleton, a burden. Silas turned in his chair. His gaze landed on her. A dark, desperate light ignited in his eyes. It was the look of a man who had sold his soul and was now looking for something else to barter. "Wait," Silas said, his voice cracking. "I have collateral." Frenchie raised an eyebrow. "You have nothing but the lint in your pockets, old man." "I have the girl," Silas whispered. The saloon, which had been buzzing with the low roar of drunken conversation, suddenly went quiet. It was a ripple effect, silence spreading from the poker table outward until even the piano player stopped mid-chord. Clara froze. The knitting needles stopped. She didn't look up, but her knuckles turned white as she gripped the gray wool. "The girl?" Frenchie leaned back, looking past Silas to the corner. "The mute? What good is she? She can't sing, she can't talk, and she looks skinny as a rail." "She works," Silas pleaded, standing up and gesturing frantically. "She cooks, she cleans, she sews. She's strong, Frenchie. Silent, too. A woman who doesn't nag? That's worth $50. Hell, that's worth $100. Frenchie stood up. He walked over to the corner. His boots crunched on the peanut shells. Clara shrank back against the rough wood of the wall. She could smell him bay rum and rot. Frenchie reached out and grabbed her chin. His fingers were cold. He forced her face up, turning it side to side. "Pretty enough," Frenchie muttered, inspecting her like he was checking the teeth of a horse. "A bit pale, but the silence. Yes, I can see the value in that." He looked back at Silas. "Put her on the table." Silas didn't hesitate. "Done." The girl against the pot. Clara felt a scream building in her throat, a massive, jagged thing that clawed at her vocal cords, but no sound came out, only a sharp intake of breath. She was being sold, not for land, not for survival, but for a hand of cards. If you are liking this story, please subscribe. I know you must have subscribed by now, so let's continue. Frenchie sat back down. He picked up his cards. He smiled. Frenchie said. Silas laid down his hand. 2 pair, 8s and queens. He grinned nervously, sweat dripping down his nose. Read 'em and weep. Frenchie didn't weep. He turned his cards over one by one. 10. Jack, queen, king. All spades. A straight flush. The blood drained from Silas's face so fast he looked like a corpse. He slumped in his chair, his mouth opening and closing like a landed fish. Unlucky, Frenchie chuckled. He raked the chips toward him. Then he stood up and walked toward the corner. Come here, mute, Frenchie said, pulling a length of rope from his belt. You belong to the house now. Clara dropped her knitting. She pressed herself into the corner, shaking her head violently. Her hands flew up, signing, no, 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 but Frenchie didn't speak the language of hands. He spoke the language of force. He grabbed her wrist. He yanked her forward. She stumbled, falling to her knees in the sawdust. Don't fight me, girl, Frenchie hissed, or I'll see if you scream as pretty as you look. Suddenly, a shadow fell over the table. It wasn't a cloud. It was a mountain. In the far back of the room, a man had been sitting alone for 3 hours. He hadn't spoken to the barmaid. He hadn't played cards. He had simply nursed a single mug of dark ale, watching the room with eyes the color of gunmetal. Declan Kincaid stood up. He was massive, 6'5" if he was an inch, with shoulders that strained the seams of his buffalo hide coat. He wore a beard that hid half his face, and a scar ran through his eyebrow, but disappearing into his hairline. He was known in the high country as the Wolf. He walked toward the poker table. His boots were heavy, thudding against the floorboards with a rhythm that sounded like a funeral drum. The crowd parted. Men who would knife their own mothers for $1 stepped aside for Declan Kincaid. He stopped at the table. He looked at Silas, who was weeping into his hands. He looked at Frenchie, who was tying the rope around Clara's wrist. Let her go, Declan said. His voice was low, a rumble of thunder trapped in a canyon. It wasn't a shout. It was a fact. Frenchie looked up. He sneered, though his eyes darted to the massive Bowie knife sheathed at Declan's hip. This is business, Wolf, Frenchie spat. Fair trade. The debt was paid. A woman ain't currency, Declan growled, and a father who bets his daughter ain't a man. Step aside, Kincaid, Frenchie warned, his hand drifting toward the pistol at his belt. You got no stake in this. Declan looked at Clara. He saw the terror in her eyes. He saw the mute plea. He saw a trapped animal, and Declan Kincaid had spent his life freeing things from traps. He didn't draw his gun. He didn't reach for his knife. He reached for the table. With a roar that shook the rafters, Declan grabbed the heavy oak poker table with both hands. I said. He heaved. The table, solid oak, weighing 300 pounds, flipped into the air as if it were made of balsa wood. Chips flew like confetti. Whiskey bottles shattered against the ceiling. The lantern swung wildly, casting dizzying shadows. The edge of the table caught Frenchie across the thighs. Crack! Frenchie screamed as his legs crumpled under the weight of the wood. He went down in a heap of felt and splinters, the rope falling from his hand. The room erupted. Get him! Someone shouted. 3 of Frenchie's hired thugs lunged forward. Declan didn't retreat. He stepped into the storm. He caught the first man with a fist the size of a ham, sending him flying over the bar. He grabbed the second man by the collar and the belt, hurling him into the third. It wasn't a fight. It was a demolition. Declan waded through the chaos, ignoring the chair that shattered over his back. He reached the corner where Clara was huddled. He extended a hand. It was scarred, calloused, and bloody. Come, he barked. Clara looked at the hand. Then she looked at the carnage. She looked at Silas, who was hiding under a bench. She took Declan's hand. He pulled her up. He didn't drag her. He shielded her. He wrapped one massive arm around her waist, lifting her almost off her feet, and plowed through the remaining crowd toward the door. They burst out into the night. The rain was torrential now, a cold deluge that soaked them instantly. Declan whistled. A massive gray stallion trotted out of the darkness, its hooves splashing in the mud. He lifted Clara onto the saddle. She gripped the pommel, her wet hair plastered to her face, her heart hammering so hard she thought it would burst. Declan swung up behind her. He was a furnace of heat against her back. He reached around her, grabbing the reins. "Hold on," he rumbled in her ear. He kicked the horse. The stallion reared, then bolted, galloping away from the black ace, away from the debt, and into the black swallowing throat of the wilderness. Clara didn't look back. She couldn't. She was too busy holding on to the wolf, wondering if she had been saved, or if she had simply been stolen by a more dangerous predator. The ascent into the Rockies was a journey out of the world of men and into the throat of the sky. The rain that had turned Deadwood into a pigsty did not follow them up the trail. Instead, as the gray stallion climbed higher, his hooves striking sparks against the granite, the air grew thin and biting, turning the moisture on Clara's coat into a stiff, freezing glaze of ice. She clung to Declan Kincaid's waist, her face buried in the rough, musk-scented buffalo fur of his coat. She couldn't feel her fingers. She couldn't feel her toes. The only heat in the entire universe radiated from the massive back of the man who had flipped a table for her. He was a silent furnace, a wall of muscle and tension that moved in perfect rhythm with the horse. They rode for hours, leaving the timberline behind, entering a landscape of jagged rock and eternal wind. Clara kept her eyes squeezed shut, the terror of the height warring with the terror of the man. "Where is he taking me?" she wondered, the question screaming in her mind but dying in her throat. Is he a savior? Or is he just a hungry wolf who stole a meal from the dogs? Just when she thought the cold would stop her heart, the stallion crested a ridge. "Whoa!" Declan grunted. The vibration of his voice traveled through his back and into her chest. Clara peeled her face away from the fur. It wasn't a house. It was a fortification against God and nature. Nestled in a bowl of granite, protected by a hanging cliff face, stood a cabin built of black pine logs the width of whiskey barrels. It was low, squat, and looked as if it had grown out of the rock itself. A chimney of river stones belched thick gray smoke that was instantly torn away by the wind. To the left, a lean-to sheltered a pile of wood that could have built a small town. To the right, a stretching rack held the raw, red hide of an elk frozen stiff. Declan dismounted. He hit the ground with a heavy thud that crunched through the snow crust. He didn't offer a hand. He simply reached up, grabbed her by the waist with hands that felt like iron clamps, and swung her down. Her legs, numb and useless from the ride, folded beneath her. She collapsed into the snow. Declan sighed a sound of profound irritation. He bent down, scooped her up by the back of her coat like a stray kitten, and marched toward the door. He kicked it open. The smell hit her first. It was a dense, physical wall of pine pitch, wood smoke, curing leather, and the metallic copper tang of old blood. He dropped her, not cruelly, but with a lack of ceremony one gives to a sack of flour. Clara landed on her feet, stumbled, and caught herself on a rough-hewn table. "Stay," Declan growled. He turned and slammed the heavy oak door, dropping a locking bar into place that looked like it could hold back a grizzly bear. Clara gasped, looking around. The cabin was a cave. The only light came from the embers in the massive hearth and a single oil lamp hanging from a rafter. Shadows stretched long and distorted across the walls, which were hung with traps, chains, and the skulls of animals. It was a place of violence and survival. There were no curtains, no rugs, no softness. Declan stomped the snow from his boots, ignoring her. He walked to the fire, grabbed a poker, and stabbed at the logs until flames roared up the chimney. Then he turned to face her. He looked even bigger in the small room. The firelight caught the scar running through his eyebrow, making his face look like a cracked map. He peeled off his heavy coat and threw it onto a bench. Underneath, he wore a buckskin shirt stained with grease and gunpowder. "Listen to me," he said, his voice rough. "I ain't a nursery maid, and I ain't looking for a wife." Clara pressed her back against the table, her eyes wide. She brought her hands up slowly, palms open, showing she had no weapon. Declan paced the floor, running a hand through his tangled hair. "I took you because I hate a cheater, and I hate a man who sells his own blood. But that don't mean I want you here." He stopped, pointing a finger at her. "You sleep there," he said, gesturing to a pile of furs in the corner near the woodbox. "When the pass clears in the spring, you go. You go to the city. You go anywhere but here. Understand?" Clara nodded slowly. Spring? That was months away. "I have traps to check," Declan muttered, strapping a snowshoe onto his boot. "Don't touch the fire. Don't touch the guns. And don't make a sound." He paused, looking at her with a sudden dark intensity. "Though I guess that last part comes easy to you." He grabbed his rifle and walked out. The door slammed. The bar thudded home. Clara was alone. For a long time she didn't move. The silence of the cabin was heavier than the noise of the saloon. Here, the silence had teeth. She shivered. The fire was roaring, but the cold was inside her. "He thinks I am simple," she thought. "He thinks I am a piece of furniture he has to dust until spring." She looked around the room. It was a disaster. It wasn't just messy, it was neglected. The floor was scattered with pine needles and dried mud. A tin plate on the table was crusted with days-old grease. But it was the larder that drew her attention. In the corner, shelves were stacked with provisions, but they were in chaos. A sack of flour had tipped over, spilling white dust over a pile of onions that were beginning to sprout. And the smell? The copper smell. Clara walked to the butcher block near the back wall. A haunch of venison lay there. It had been quartered but not finished. The meat was dark, and along the bone a green sheen of rot was beginning to take hold. He had killed it, brought it in, and then distracted or drunk or just careless left it. If she did nothing, the meat would spoil. If the meat spoiled, they would starve when the deep snows came. Clara looked at the door. He had told her not to touch anything. But Clara O'Malley had survived a stepfather who bet her in card games. She had survived a silence that isolated her from the world. She had survived by being useful, by being the one thing men didn't expect competent. She rolled up the sleeves of her sodden wool dress. She found a heavy butcher knife on the table. She tested the edge with her thumb. It was dull. She found a whetstone. Scrape, scrape, scrape. The rhythmic sound filled the cabin, a small defiance against the mountain wind. When the edge was razor sharp, she went to work. She cut away the rot with surgical precision, slicing off the green-tainted flesh and throwing it into the fire, where it hissed and popped. She carved the good meat into strips. She found the salt crock buried under a pile of dirty rags and rubbed the coarse grains into the red flesh until her fingers stung. She found the smoke hooks in the chimney. She hung the strips high, where the smoke would cure them into jerky. She didn't stop there. She swept the floor with a bundle of twigs. She scrubbed the grease from the plates with snow she melted in a bucket. Then she saw his coat. The buffalo coat he had thrown on the bench. It was a magnificent thing, heavy and warm, but the lining was torn. The pocket was ripping away from the leather. It was a coat that was slowly falling apart, much like the man who wore it. Clara found a bone needle in a jar on the mantel. She pulled a thread from the hem of her own petticoat, strong linen thread. She sat by the fire, the heavy coat draped over her lap. In, out. The work was meditative. It was a language. I am here, the needle said. I am not a burden, the thread whispered. I earn my keep. Hours passed. The light in the window faded from gray to black. The wind outside rose to a howl, shaking the heavy door. Suddenly the bar lifted. Thud. The door swung open. Declan blew in with a gust of snow. He looked exhausted. His beard was frosted white, and he dragged a brace of rabbits in his left hand. He looked like a man expecting to find a cold, dark cabin and a weeping girl. He stopped. He blinked. The cabin was warm. The floor was swept clean. The smell of rot was gone, replaced by the savory, salty scent of curing meat. He looked at the butcher block. The venison was processed, the waste gone, the good meat hanging in the chimney. He looked at the table, set with a clean plate. He looked at Clara. She was sitting by the fire, her hands resting in her lap. She looked up at him. Her eyes were dark and unreadable. Next to her, folded neatly on the bench, was his buffalo coat. Declan dropped the rabbits. He walked over to the bench. He picked up the coat. He saw the pocket. It was stitched back into place with tiny, perfect white stitches that stood out against the dark leather. He ran his thumb over the seam. It was stronger than the original sewing. He looked at the lining. The tear was gone. He turned slowly to look at her. I told you not to touch my things, he grumbled. But the anger was gone from his voice, replaced by a confused, grudging rumble. Clara didn't flinch. She simply raised her hands. She pointed to the coat. Then she pointed to the fire. Then she pointed to herself. Warmth, she sighed, though he didn't know the word, survival. Declan stared at her for a long moment. He saw the blister on her thumb from the needle. He saw the blood on her apron from the venison. He let out a long breath, the tension in his shoulders dropping an inch. You missed a spot on the floor, he lied, his voice gruff. He walked to the fire and warmed his hands. He didn't say thank you. He didn't smile. But when he sat down at the table, he didn't turn his back to her. And when he ate the stew she had managed to cobble together from the scraps, he scraped the plate clean. The friction was still there. He was a wolf who wanted to be alone, and she was a bird in his den. But the dynamic had shifted. She wasn't livestock anymore. She was an unexpected variable in his equation of survival. And Declan Kincaid hated variables almost as much as he hated how good the clean cabin smelled. The blizzard didn't arrive with a howl. It arrived with a sudden, suffocating silence that pressed against the eardrums like deep water. The wind, which had been stripping the needles from the pines for 2 days, abruptly died. The sky turned a bruised, heavy purple, and the air inside the cabin grew thick and static-charged, making the hair on Clara's arms stand up. Declan stood by the window, staring out at the ridge. He was restless, a caged animal pacing the perimeter of a trap he had built himself. He checked the barometer hanging by the door, a brass instrument that had belonged to a dead man. The needle had bottomed out. White death, he muttered, more to the glass than to her. He turned to Clara, who was kneading dough on the table. She stopped, her flour-dusted hands hovering over the wood. I have to check the high line, Declan said, strapping his heavy snowshoes to his pack. If the storm breaks hard, the traps will be buried until spring. We need the meat. Clara wiped her hands on her apron. She moved toward him, her eyes wide. She signed Noah's sharp, cutting motion with her hand. She pointed to the window, then to the heavy gray darkness that was swallowing the peaks. I know the mountain, Declan growled, pulling his buffalo coat on. The mending she had done on the pocket held fast, a stark reminder of her presence. I'll be back before the first flake hits. Keep the fire high. If I'm not back by dark, bar the door and don't... He grabbed his rifle. He didn't look at her again. He opened the door, and the cold sucked the heat from the room instantly. Then he was gone, swallowed by the unnatural twilight. Clara barred the door. She went back to the dough, but her rhythm was broken. She found herself stopping every few minutes to listen. An hour passed, then 2. The silence broke. It started as a low moan in the chimney, then escalated into a shriek that shook the heavy timbers of the roof. The snow began, not soft flakes, but ice pellets that hit the logs like buckshot. The temperature in the cabin plummeted. Clara abandoned the bread. She paced. She added logs to the fire until the hearth roared, but the cold seeped through the chinking. Darkness fell completely. Thump. It wasn't the wind. It was a heavy, wet sound against the door. Clara froze. She grabbed the heavy iron poker from the hearth. She waited. Scrape. Open. A voice, ragged and weak. Clara threw the bar up. The wind tore the door from her grasp, slamming it against the inside wall. Declan fell into the room. He didn't walk in, he collapsed, a mountain of snow and fur crashing onto the floorboards. Clara threw her weight against the door, fighting the gale to shut it. She dropped the bar and fell to her knees beside him. He was conscious, but barely. His face was a mask of gray agony, his beard caked with ice and blood, not his face, his leg. His right pant leg was shredded. Dark, arterial blood pulsed through the torn buckskin, pooling on the floor. Shale, he gasped, his teeth chattering so violently the words were chopped into pieces. Gave way, slid, hit the edge. He tried to push himself up, his pride warring with his body. I'm fine. Just need whiskey. He wasn't fine. He was dying. Clara didn't panic. Her silence, often a curse, was now her armor. She didn't waste breath on screaming. She didn't waste time asking questions. She grabbed his knife from his belt. She cut the pant leg away. The wound was horrific. A gash, 6 inches long, deep enough to expose the white sheen of bone. The cold had slowed the bleeding, but the warmth of the cabin was making it flow again. She needed to stop it. Now! She stood up. She ran to the fire. She grabbed the heavy iron poker she had been holding. She shoved the tip into the heart of the coals. Declan watched her through slit eyes. He saw what she was doing. He tried to kick out, to crawl away. No, he groaned. Don't burn me, girl. Clara turned. She pointed to the wound. She pointed to the blood spreading across the floor. She pointed to the poker, glowing a dull, angry cherry red. Her eyes were hard. There was no pity in them, only a fierce, terrifying competence. She came back to him. She sat on his good leg to pin him down. She took his heavy hand and placed it on her shoulder, giving him something to crush. She looked at him. I am sorry, her eyes said, but I am not letting you die. She pressed the iron to the wound. Declan didn't scream. He roared. It was a sound torn from the bottom of his soul, a primal release of agony that rivaled the storm outside. His hand clamped onto her shoulder, his grip bruising, crushing, desperate. The smell of searing flesh and singing hair filled the small room, acrid and sickening. Clara didn't flinch. She held the iron steady until the sizzling stopped, until the wound was sealed in a brutal blackened line. Then she threw the iron aside. Declan went limp. He passed out, his head lolling back onto the wood, his breath coming in shallow, ragged hitches. The next 3 days were a blur of firelight and shadows. The storm buried the cabin. The snow piled up past the windows, sealing them in a tomb of ice. Inside, the battle for Declan's life raged on. The infection came fast, as it always did with deep wounds. By the second night, Declan was burning. His skin was dry and hot as parchment. He thrashed in the furs Clara had piled on the floor, fighting invisible enemies. "Don't bet," he mumbled, his voice thick with delirium. "Don't put her on the table, Pa, don't." Clara sat beside him, dipping a rag into a bucket of snowmelt. She bathed his forehead. She trickled water between his cracked lips. She didn't sleep. She barely ate. She was the anchor in his storm. She listened to his fever dreams. She heard the fragments of a broken man. "Sarah," he whispered, clutching Clara's wrist in the middle of the night. "I'm coming back. I have the money. Just wait." Clara froze. "Sarah." "She's too small," Declan wept, tears leaking from his closed eyes. "She's just a little girl. Don't take her. I'll kill you. I'll flip the world over." Clara understood then. The rage in the saloon, the table flip, the hatred of the gamble. He hadn't saved Clara because she was special. He had saved her because he couldn't save Sarah. A sister? A daughter? It didn't matter. He was a man haunting himself, trying to pay a debt that could never be settled. She looked at his face, the scar, the gray in his beard, the lines of pain etched around his mouth. He wasn't a wolf. He was a guard dog who had been beaten for barking. On the third morning the fever broke. Clara was asleep, her head resting on her knees, sitting on the floor beside his pallet. She woke to the feeling of eyes on her. She lifted her head. Declan was awake. His eyes were clear. The glassy sheen of the fever was gone, replaced by a deep, weary blue. He was looking at her as if he had never seen her before. "You stayed," he rasped. His voice was a wreck, like gravel grinding on glass. Clara nodded. She reached for the water cup and held it to his lips. He drank greedily, some of it spilling into his beard. He lay back, staring at the ceiling beams. "I thought I was dead," he whispered. "I felt the fire. I thought I was in hell." He turned his head to look at her. "Why didn't you let me go?" he asked. "You could have taken the gold. You could have waited for the thaw. I'm a mean son of a bitch, Clara. No one would have blamed you." Clara set the cup down. She looked at her hands, chapped, red, tired hands. She reached out. Slowly, tentatively, she placed her hand on his chest right over his heart. She could feel the steady, strong beat beneath the ribs. Boom, 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 boom. She looked him in the eye. She tapped his chest, then tapped her own. "Life," she sighed. "You are life." Declan stared at her hand. It was small against his massive chest. It was the only gentle thing that had touched him in 10 years. "My sister," he said suddenly, the words tumbling out as if the fever had loosened a dam. "Sarah. She was 10. My father. He was like yours, a gambler, a drunk." He closed his eyes. "He bet her. On a horse race. He lost. I was 12. I tried to stop them. They broke my arm. They took her away. I never saw her again. I spent 20 years looking. I found the man who took her, but I never found her." He opened his eyes. They were wet. "When I saw you in that chair, knitting, and I saw that bastard Vane put you on the table." His voice broke. He couldn't finish. Clara felt a tear slip down her own cheek. She understood the silence of the cabin now. It wasn't emptiness. It was a vigil. He was keeping watch for a ghost that would never come home. She leaned forward. She didn't sign. She didn't try to speak. She reached out and placed her hand on his cheek, covering the scar that ran through his beard. Her palm was cooled against his skin. Declan flinched, instinctively pulling back, but he stopped. He froze. He leaned into her hand. He closed his eyes, exhaling a breath he seemed to have been holding since he was 12 years old. "I ain't a good man, Clara," he whispered into her palm. "I'm broken, on sharp edges." Clara shook her head. She moved her thumb, tracing the line of his jaw. "Rough," her eyes said, "but not broken." Declan reached up. His massive hand engulfed hers, pressing it tighter against his face. "Are you afraid?" he asked, his voice barely audible. Clara looked at the door that kept the world out. She looked at the fire she had kept burning. She looked at the wolf who had flipped a table to save a mute girl. She shook her head. "No." For the first time, the silence between them wasn't heavy. It was a bridge, and as the storm finally began to die outside, leaving the world buried in white, Declan Kincaid realized that the woman he had tried to push away was the only thing keeping him from freezing to death. Which country are you watching this video from? Please let me know in the comments below. The thaw did not arrive with a song, it arrived with the sound of weeping. The high Rockies, held in the iron grip of winter for 6 endless months, finally began to bleed. Icicles that had hung like daggers from the eaves lost their purchase, crashing onto the porch with the sound of shattering glass. The creek, silent and buried under 10 feet of drift, woke up with a roar, a brown churning artery of mud and meltwater that echoed off the canyon walls. Inside the cabin, the air had changed. It was no longer the stale, recycled breath of 2 people trapped in a wooden lung. It was heavy with moisture, smelling of wet wool, damp earth, and the sharp green scent of pine resin warming in the sun. Declan Kincaid sat at the heavy oak table, his bad legs stretched out stiffly before him. The wound healed into a jagged, angry pucker of scar tissue that pulled tight every time the pressure dropped, leaving him with a permanent, rolling limp. He was cleaning his rifle, a heavy Sharps buffalo gun that fired a cartridge the size of a man's thumb. Scrape, oil, click. The rhythm was soothing, but his eyes were not. They were fixed on the window, watching the steam rise from the melting snow in the yard. Clara was at the hearth. She was boiling laundry, his shirts and her dress in a massive cast-iron cauldron suspended over the fire. The water roiled and spat, smelling of harsh lye soap. She moved with a quiet, efficient grace, her silence no longer a void in the room, but a companion. She turned to look at him. She caught him staring at the tree line. She tapped the ladle against the rim of the pot. Clink. Declan looked at her. "Coffee?" her eyebrows asked. He shook his head. "Quiet today," he rumbled. "Too quiet. The jays aren't scolding." Clara frowned. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked to the window. She looked out. The world was bright, painfully so, the sun reflecting off the remaining snowpack. Then she saw it. A flash of light, not sun on snow, sun on metal. Down in the draw where the trail switched back up the mountain, something moved. A horse. Then another. Clara stiffened. She turned to Declan, her hand flying to her throat. Declan saw her face. He didn't ask. He moved. He grabbed the Sharps. He grabbed the box of cartridges. He blew out the oil lamp, plunging the cabin into the dim gray of the natural light. "Get down," he hissed. He dragged himself to the window, peering through the crack in the heavy shutter. 5 riders. They were picking their way up the muddy track, their horses blowing hard in the thin air. At the lead was a man riding a mule. His legs were strapped stiffly into custom stirrups, his knees bent at awkward, unnatural angles. He wore a fine city suit that was splattered with mud, and a hat that cost more than Declan's horse. Frenchie. The card shark whose legs Declan had crushed with a poker table. He hadn't forgotten, and he hadn't forgiven. "He came back," Declan whispered, a cold, hard knot forming in his stomach. "The devil came back for his due." Clara crawled to his side. She saw the man on the mule. She went pale. She remembered the cold touch of his fingers on her chin. She remembered the rope. She grabbed Declan's arm, her grip frantic. "I know," Declan growled, covering her hand with his. "He wants you, and he wants my hide for his legs." He looked at the door. It was barred, but pine logs wouldn't stop a siege. Go to the root cellar, Declan ordered, pointing to the trap door under the rug. Take the knife. Clara shook her head violently. No! She pointed to him. She pointed to his leg. You can't run. I ain't running, Declan said, his voice dropping to that terrifying low register, the wolf's growl. I'm the one holding the door. Before she could argue, a voice echoed from the yard. Kincaid. It was Frenchy. His voice was thin and reedy, carried on the wind. I know you're in there, you mountain trash, and I know you have my property. Declan chambered around. The sound was loud in the quiet cabin. Clack thud. You owe me, Kincaid, Frenchy screamed. $50 and a pair of legs. Send the mute out. Send her out, and maybe I'll let you keep your eyes. Declan didn't answer. He rested the heavy barrel of the sharps on the windowsill. Send her, Frenchy yelled. Boys, wake him up. The first shot didn't hit the house. It hit the water bucket on the porch. Pang! The bucket exploded, water spraying everywhere. Then the world disintegrated. 5 rifles opened up at once. Bullets hammered the logs like hail. Wood splinters flew across the room, deadly as shrapnel. The window shutter disintegrated. A slug punched through a chink in the logs and slammed into the skillet hanging by the fire with a deafening gong. Clara screamed a silent, terrified gasp and threw herself flat on the floor, covering her head. Declan didn't flinch. He waited. In out. He saw a muzzle flash from behind a boulder. Boom! The sharps roared. The cabin filled with white smoke. Down in the yard a man screamed. The heavy .50 caliber slug had punched through the rock, with a man behind it. One rider went down, his horse rearing and bolting. Get around the back, Frenchy shrieked. Burn him out! Smoke the rat! Reloading, Declan grunted. His hands moved with a blur, ejecting the spent brass and jamming a fresh shell home. He turned to the back wall. There was no window there, just solid log. But he heard them. The squelch of boots in the mud, the heavy breathing of men hauling brush. They're going to fire the roof, Declan realized. He looked at Clara. She was huddled under the table. She wasn't crying. She was watching him, her eyes wide with a question. What do we do? Declan's leg throbbed. He couldn't maneuver. He couldn't chase them. He was a turret in a burning fortress. Fire! Someone yelled outside. A torch landed on the dry thatch of the lean-to. The woodpile caught instantly. The roar of the fire joined the roar of the guns. Smoke began to curl under the eaves. They want us out, Declan coughed, his eyes watering. They want to shoot us down like dogs in the yard. He looked at the door. Clara, he barked, get the pistol. He pointed to the heavy Colt Navy revolver hanging on the peg. Clara scrambled across the floor. Bullets were still thumping into the logs, dusting her hair with sawdust. She grabbed the gun. It was heavy, smelling of oil. Watch the window, Declan commanded. I have to stop the fire. He grabbed a heavy wool blanket from the bed. He dipped it into the water bucket, what was left of it. He unbarred the door. Don't shoot me, he muttered. He kicked the door open. He stepped out onto the porch. A hail of lead greeted him. A bullet tore through the sleeve of his shirt. Another chipped the stone of the chimney next to his head. Declan didn't stop. He roared a sound of pure feral rage that drowned out the gunfire. He threw the wet blanket onto the burning lean-to. It hissed, steam billowing up, smothering the flames for a second. There he is! Kill him! Frenchy screamed from the safety of the tree line. Declan turned. He raised the sharps. He didn't aim at the men. He aimed at Frenchy's mule. Boom! The mule dropped like a stone. Frenchy went down with it, screaming as his crippled legs were pinned under the dead animal. My legs! Frenchy wailed. The gunmen hesitated. Their paymaster was down. Declan used the second. He retreated into the cabin and slammed the door, throwing the bar back into place. He leaned against the wood, breathing hard. Blood was trickling down his arm where the bullet had grazed him. "Got him," he grinned, a wolfish baring of teeth. But he had forgotten the window. While he was on the porch, one of the hired guns, a wiry man with a knife between his teeth, had crept up the blind side of the cabin. He didn't shoot. He vaulted. He crashed through the shattered remains of the window shutter, tumbling into the room in a shower of glass and wood. He landed on the table. Clara was right there. The gunman saw her. He grinned. He kicked the Colt pistol from her hand before she could raise it. It skittered across the floor, sliding under the bed. "Hello, darling," the gunman sneered. He lunged. Declan turned. "No!" He tried to move. His bad leg buckled. He fell to one knee. He was too far away. The sharps was empty. The gunman grabbed Clara by the hair. He yanked her head back, pressing a knife to her throat. "Drop it, wolf!" the gunman screamed at Declan, "or I open her up." Declan froze. The rage in his chest was a physical thing, a nuclear heat, but he was helpless. The blade was pressing into the white skin of her neck. A single drop of blood welled up. Clara's eyes met Declan's. She saw the terror in his face. She saw the wolf that clawed. She looked at the gunman. He was smelling her hair. He was confident. He thought she was a mute, helpless thing, a poker chip. He didn't know about the lye soap. They were standing next to the hearth, next to the cauldron. The water was still boiling. Clara didn't scream. She didn't struggle. She went limp for a fraction of a second, making the gunman think she had surrendered. He relaxed his grip just an inch. That was all she needed. Clara drove her elbow backward into his stomach. It wasn't a hard blow, but it surprised him. He doubled over slightly. Clara grabbed the iron handle of the cauldron with her bare hand. The metal seared her palm, but she didn't feel it. She twisted her body. She swung the ladle, heavy cast iron, full of boiling soapy water. She didn't aim for his chest. She aimed for his face. Splash! The boiling water hit the gunman full in the eyes. He didn't just scream. He shrieked a high, inhuman sound that shattered the tension in the room. He dropped the knife. He clawed at his face, the skin blistering instantly, the lye burning into his eyes. "My eyes. God, my eyes." He stumbled back, blind and agonizing. Clara didn't stop. She grabbed the butcher knife from the table, the same knife she had used to trim the rot from the venison. She advanced. The gunman swung blindly, his fists hitting empty air. Clara stepped in. She didn't hesitate. She drove the knife into his thigh. He howled and collapsed, curling into a ball on the floor, sobbing. Declan watched, his mouth slightly open. He saw Clara standing over the fallen man. She was breathing hard. Her hair was wild. Her hand was burned red from the ladle. She held the bloody knife. She looked up at Declan. She wasn't the victim. She wasn't the poker chip. She was the one who flipped the table. Outside, the shooting had stopped. Frenchie was screaming in the mud. The other gunmen, seeing their leader down and hearing the torture of their comrade inside, were losing their nerve. Declan scrambled to his feet, ignoring the pain in his leg. He grabbed the loaded Colt from under the bed. He walked to Clara. He touched her shoulder gently. She looked at him. Her eyes were fierce. "Reload the sharps," Declan whispered. Clara nodded. She dropped the knife. She picked up the heavy buffalo gun. Declan went to the window. He looked out at the confused, terrified men in the yard. "Leave!" he roared, his voice booming like Judgment Day, "or the girl comes out next, and she's meaner than I am." He fired a shot into the dirt near them. The hired guns didn't wait. They scrambled for their horses, leaving Frenchie pinned under his mule, screaming curses at the sky. They rode for the tree line, terrified of the wolf and his silent, scalding banshee of a wife. The cabin was quiet again, save for the moans of the blinded man on the floor and the crackle of the fire. Clara leaned against the table, her burned hand throbbing, and watched Declan bar the door. They had held the line. The debt was cancelled in blood. The silence that returned to the cabin was not the heavy, suffocating quiet of the blizzard, nor was it the tense electric silence of the ambush. It was the silence of a battlefield after the cannons had cooled a hollow, ringing emptiness that smelled of sulfur, burnt lye, and the copper tang of blood. The intruder on the floor had stopped screaming. He lay curled in a fetal ball, whimpering softly, his hands pressed over his ruined eyes. The fight had gone out of him, washed away by the agony of the boiling water and the shock of the knife in his leg. Declan didn't look at him. He looked at Clara. She was leaning against the rough-hewn table, her chest heaving, her hair plastered to her forehead with sweat and steam. Her right hand, the hand that had wielded the ladle, was red and blistering, trembling uncontrollably at her side. She looked small in the dim light, a porcelain doll that had walked through a furnace and come out made of steel. "Sit," Declan rasped. His voice was no longer a roar, it was a broken thing rough with smoke and fear. Clara sank onto the bench. She didn't look at her hand. She looked at him. She checked him for holes. "I'm fine," Declan lied, ignoring the blood dripping from his arm. He walked to the intruder. He bent down, grabbing the man by the collar of his coat. He didn't say a word. He dragged him across the floorboards, leaving a smear of blood and soapy water in his wake. He opened the door. Outside, the air was crisp and cold, the sun beginning to dip low, painting the snow in shades of violet and bruised orange. Frenchie was silent now, pinned under the mule. The cold had taken him, or perhaps the shock. He was slumped over the saddle horn, unconscious. Declan dragged the blinded gunman to the edge of the porch and shoved him into the snowbank next to his boss. "Crawl," Declan growled. "Crawl back to the valley. If I see you again, I won't miss." He slammed the door. He barred it. He didn't care if they lived or died. He only cared about the woman sitting on his bench. He limped to the larder. He found the jar of bear grease mixed with calendula, the salve she had made. He found clean linen strips. He knelt in front of her. "Give me your hand," he whispered. Clara hesitated. The adrenaline was fading, and the pain was rushing in, a throbbing, searing heat that made her nauseous. Declan reached out and took her wrist. His touch was terrified. He treated her hand as if it were a wounded bird, something so fragile that his own roughness might crush it. "I did this," he choked out, scooping a globe of cool yellow salve onto his fingers. "I put you in this room. I put that ladle in your hand." He began to apply the salve. The relief was instant, drawing a sharp intake of breath from Clara. "You shouldn't have had to fight," Declan murmured, wrapping the linen around her palm with agonizing slowness. "A woman like you should be knitting. You should be in a garden. You shouldn't be scalding men's eyes out." He finished the bandage. He tied the knot with his teeth, his hands shaking too much to manage the loops. Then he stood up. He walked to the hearth. He pried up the loose stone where he kept his cash. He pulled out the heavy iron box. He carried it to the table. He set it down. He opened it. It was filled with gold dust, silver dollars, and a thick roll of greenbacks, the savings of a lifetime of trapping and bounty hunting. He pushed the box toward her. "Take it," Declan said. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He looked at the wall, at the rifle, at anything but her. Clara stared at the box. She tilted her head, confused. The pass will be clear in 2 days, Declan said, his voice hard and flat. Take the gray stallion. He knows the way down. This is enough money to get you to San Francisco, to New York, anywhere. He turned to her then, and his face was a mask of misery. Go, Clara. Get away from me. Clara stood up. She ignored the pain in her hand. She walked around the table until she was standing in front of him. She reached out and touched his chest. Why? Her eyes asked. Because I am death, Declan shouted, pulling away from her touch. He paced the small room, limping heavily. Look at this place. Look at the blood on the floor. I attract violence, Clara. It's in my blood. My father bet my sister. I bet my life. And today... He stopped, his back to her, his shoulders heaving. Today, I almost got you killed. Frenchie came back because of me. The next one will come, because of me. You deserve life. You deserve silence that isn't full of gunshots. He turned back to her, pleading. I am a wolf, Clara. Wolves don't have hearths, we just have dens, and sooner or later the hunters come. Clara looked at him. She looked at the scar on his face. She looked at the hands that had flipped a table to save her. She looked at the man who thought he was poison, when in reality, he was the only antidote she had ever known. She looked at the box of gold. He walked over to it. She picked it up. It was heavy. Declan watched her, his heart breaking. She's going, he thought. She's smart. She knows I'm right. Clara walked to the fire. She didn't throw the gold in. That would be foolish. Gold doesn't burn. Instead, she turned and walked to the door. She unbarred it. She opened it. She stepped out onto the porch. Declan followed her, confused. Clara? She walked to the edge of the ravine where the snow dropped off into 1,000 feet of emptiness. She turned the box upside down. Clatter, clink, whoosh! The gold dust shimmered in the twilight like a golden snow. The silver dollars flashed as they fell, tumbling down into the deep, unreachable crevasses of the rock. The greenbacks fluttered like dying moths, spiraling down into the darkness. She emptied it all, every cent, every ticket to a soft life. She dropped the empty iron box into the snow. She turned back to Declan. He stood in the doorway, his mouth open, his face pale. You crazy woman! That was everything! Clara walked up to him. She didn't stop until she was toe-to-toe with the giant. She reached up with her good hand. She grabbed the lapels of his blood-stained buckskin shirt. She yanked him down, or tried to. He slumped, his knees giving way under the weight of her intensity. She looked him dead in the eye. Tapped his chest. You. She tapped the cabin floor. Here. She made a fist and placed it over her heart. Home. She didn't need a slate. She didn't need a voice. The message was screamed into the silence. I don't want the gold. I don't want the city. I want the wolf. You choose this? Declan whispered, his voice trembling. You choose the blood, the cold, the danger? Clara nodded. Her eyes were fierce, blazing with a fire that melted the ice in his soul. She reached up and touched the scar on his eyebrow, the mark of his brokenness. She traced it, then leaned in and pressed her lips to it. It was a kiss of absolution. Declan broke. A sob ripped out of his chest, a jagged sound of surrender. He wrapped his massive arms around her, burying his face in her neck, holding her so tight he thought he might crush her. But she didn't pull away. She held him back, her strength matching his. I tried, he wept into her hair. I tried to let you go. Clara shook her head against his shoulder. She pulled back and looked at him. She smiled, a small, tired, beautiful thing. She brought her hands up. She formed a shape he hadn't seen before. She interlaced her fingers, locking them together tight. bonded. Declan looked at her hands. Then he looked at her face. My table, he choked out, realizing the truth. I flipped the table, but I didn't clear the deck. I set it. He leaned down and kissed her. It wasn't gentle. It was desperate, tasting of salt and smoke and a terrifying hope. It was a vow sealed not in a church, but in the blood-soaked snow of the high country. My home, he whispered against her lips. My wife. Clara closed her eyes and rested her head on his chest, listening to the beat of his heart. It was steady. It was strong. And for the first time in her life, it was hers. Epilogue 2 years later. The summer sun in the Rockies was a deceptive thing, bright and hot, but with a sharp edge of chill in the wind that reminded you the winter was never far away. The cabin had changed. The lean-to was gone, replaced by a sturdy barn built of stone and timber. A fenced paddock held the gray stallion and a new mare, their coats shining in the high-altitude light. But the biggest change was the porch. It had been expanded, wide and welcoming, with 2 rocking chairs hewn from pine. Declan sat in one, whittling a piece of cedar. He was shirtless, the scars on his arms fading to silver lines against his tanned skin. His beard was trimmed, and the wild, hunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a calm, watchful peace. He stopped whittling. He looked at the door. Clara stepped out. She wore a dress of blue calico, the color of the mountain sky. Her hair was braided back, revealing her face fully. There was no fear in it. She carried a tray with 2 mugs of coffee and a plate of fresh biscuits. She set the tray on the table between the chairs. She sat down next to him. She reached over and tapped his knee. Declan looked at her. She pointed to the valley below where the clouds were gathering. Storm coming, she sighed. Let it come, Declan said, his voice a low rumble of contentment. Wood stacked, meat smoked. He reached out and took her hand, the right hand. The scar from the lye burn was still there, a web of white tissue across her palm. It was a map of their survival. He raised her hand to his lips and kissed the scar. We're ready, he said. Clara smiled. She picked up her coffee and looked out over the peaks. The silence of the mountain was vast, stretching for miles in every direction. But it wasn't lonely. It was a container for everything that mattered. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a small object. She placed it on the arm of Declan's chair. It was a playing card, the ace of spades. Declan looked at it. He laughed, a true, deep sound of joy that echoed off the granite walls. He picked up the card and flicked it off the porch. It caught the wind, fluttering down into the canyon, spiraling away, until it was just a speck against the green of the pines. They watched it go. Then, without a word, they clasped hands, the wolf and the silent, watching the storm roll in, knowing that no matter how hard the wind blew, the house would stand. The table was set, and no one would ever flip it again.